I'm Arlen Geyer. Today I want to talk about using your camera in manual mode and how to get a good exposure. I've heard how to get a good exposure when you're shooting in manual. If you've been using your camera in automatic mode, like portrait or landscape or sport or backlit or night or one of those scenic modes, then you've been letting the camera make all of the exposure decisions for you. But as a photographer, you want to be making those decisions yourself. So the first thing is to understand what I mean by exposure. Turn around, buddy. Thanks. He wants to show off his tail feathers. Anyway, so the first thing you want to do is understand what an exposure is. So the exposure is the amount of light in the photograph, which has nothing to do with the amount of light in the scene. You could have a very dark scene, a nighttime scene, which is correctly exposed, which means that the photograph has the correct amount of light in it. Or you could have a very bright scene, a sandy beach or a snow scene, and with a great deal of bright sunlight, and still have a correct exposure. Or you could have an underexposure where there's not enough light in the photograph. So it doesn't matter how much light was in the scene. If the photograph ends up not getting enough light, then it's going to be too dark. It's going to be what's called underexposed. And that would look kind of like this. Whereas if you allow too much light into the camera, then you'll have an overexposure. And that looks like this, where you have everything washed out. So the goal is to have somewhere in the middle where you give the sensor the right amount of light, the amount of light that it wants. And that will give you a correct exposure, something like this. So how do you get that? Well, there are three things that control the exposure. There's the aperture, and the aperture is how big the lens opening is. So you can have a large lens opening that's going to let a lot of light in at a time, or you can have a very small lens opening that's just going to let a little bit of light in at a time. And you control that with the f-stop. And the f-stop is written as f/ and a number. And the reason it's written that way is it's actually a fraction, which it gets confusing for some people because it means that the larger the number, like F11 or F16 or F22, is actually a small opening, whereas a small number like F5.6 or F4 or even F2.8 is going to be a big opening. And the reason for that is because it's a fraction, so don't let that throw you. Everything's backwards. And so the aperture is how much light you're letting in at a time. The second setting that controls your exposure is the shutter speed. And the shutter speed is, you start off where the sensor is hidden from the light, like this, and then for a brief moment that opens up and lets the light in and then closes again. And that happens when you push the button. It opens up the shutter and allows light to get into the sensor, and then it closes again. And that is a very brief period of time, a whole lot shorter than that. It could be as short as 1,000th of a second or even an 8,000th of a second, a very, very short time. So that controls how long the sensor is being exposed to light. So you have these two different factors: how much light you're letting in at one time and how long you're letting it in. If you think about, suppose you were running water from your faucet to fill up a glass, and you can let the water just trickle out of the faucet and wait for a long time while it fills up. And that would be like having a very small aperture, a small opening, and exposing for a long time. Or you could crank that faucet up and have it really pour fast and do it for a very short period of time. And that would be like having a large opening and having a much shorter exposure time. So those are the two factors that control how much light is reaching the sensor. The third factor that is involved here is ISO, which stands for International Standards Organization, in case you're interested. But the ISO controls how much light the sensor wants to get. It controls the sensitivity of the sensor. So you establish how much light the sensor wants to get with the ISO, and then how much it actually is getting with the combination of aperture and shutter speed. So to have complete manual control of these three factors, you want to shoot in manual mode. In manual mode, you set the aperture that you want, and the shutter speed that you want, and the ISO that you want. Now, because you're setting all these things, you have the possibility of not getting a correct exposure. So, in order to get a correct exposure, you use the light meter that is built into your camera. And the light meter has a scale that you can see in the viewfinder or on an info display screen on your LCD. And it looks, there are a couple different varieties of scale here. It might look like just a linear scale with a 0 in the middle, or it might look like just have a lot of slashes. Here are some examples of what it might look like. And your goal is to have it get centered. So one that is not centered might look like this with it offset to one side, or it might look like this over here with just a bunch of hash marks on one side or the other. But the goal is to either get rid of all those hash marks on that type of display, which is common on a Nikon camera, or to put that indicator into the center, which is common on a Canon camera. Other types of cameras have different approaches. But basically, these are the two concepts, and the goal is adjust any one of your ISO, shutter speed, or aperture in order to get that indicator centered. And when that indicator is centered, that should give you a correct exposure. Now, there are different combinations of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO that will achieve that result. And that part of the artistry of photography is determining what combination will be best for any given situation. So, although the details of this are a little beyond the scope of this particular video, the basic concept is with ISO, the lower the ISO, the less digital noise or static you'll have in your image, and that is almost always desirable. But the downside of a low ISO is, and a low ISO would be like 100 or 200, somewhere in that neighborhood. The downside is that it requires more light. So you'd have to have a slower shutter speed or a larger aperture in order to get a correct exposure. So with aperture, the flip side of there is with a large aperture, of course, you're letting more light in, which is often desirable. But with a smaller aperture, you get greater depth of field. And depth of field is basically the amount that is in focus in front of and behind the object that you're focused on. So if you're focused on the parrot here, how much is in focus in front of and behind that parrot is your depth of field. Great depth of field would be a lot. Shallow depth of field would be very little. And so if you want great depth of field, you're going to want to use a smaller aperture. And that, of course, lets less light in. Now, sometimes you want shallow depth of field. So that can be an advantage. That can be sort of a win-win situation. Now with shutter speed, of course, the faster the shutter speed, the more you'll freeze motion. So if this parrot is spinning around and I want to capture it and freeze that motion, then I'm going to want to use a somewhat fast shutter speed. And if he's really going fast, I'm not going to do that, but if he's really spinning fast, I need a really fast shutter speed. And of course, the downside of that is that you are letting less light in. So you need to find the combination of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed that'll produce the most desirable results for a particular situation. And that is basically the heart of what photography is all about. You go, guy. Okay, so eventually you'll learn that there are situations where you actually don't want to get that indicator into the center. There's sometimes where you deliberately want to have it above or below that, but until you learn about that and understand that concept, the goal is on every shot to put that indicator into the center in order to get a correct exposure. All right, I hope that was useful to you.